Welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics Seminar Series for the 2022-23 academic year. I am Jennifer Gibson, Director of the Joint Centre for Bioethics, and it's my pleasure to be moderating today's seminar. Today's speaker is Florence Ashley, who will be presenting on the limits of criminalizing conversion practices. The format of today's seminar is a presentation by our speaker, followed by a moderated discussion with you, the audience. The seminar is being recorded and will be posted on the Joint Centre for Bioethics website, where you can also find archived seminars. Before I introduce Florence, I'd like to begin by acknowledging this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Florence Ashley is a trans feminine jurist and bioethicist currently completing a doctorate in the Faculty of Law and the Collaborative Specialization in Bioethics at the University of Toronto. They previously received BCL, JD, and LLM degrees from McGill University and served as the first openly trans feminine clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. Florence is widely published in trans law and bioethics and is the author of Banning Conversion Practices, a Legal and Policy Analysis, which was recently published by UBC Press in 2022. Florence has received numerous awards in recognition of their exceptional scholarship, including a Shirk Joseph Armand Balbardier Canada Graduate Scholarship, the University of Toronto Adele etc., the Distinguished Graduate Award, and the Peter A. Singer Award in Bioethics at the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics. Florence, we look forward to your presentation.
So hello, everybody. Also, because this is a mood, here's my new mustache. I hope you enjoy it as much as I am. Also, I wanted to show the book because it's so pretty. Very pretty book. I hope you get it, if only because you want to put it in your library, like front up, just be like, look at this pretty book. I've never read it, but it's very pretty. Or you can read it, that would be even better. But, you don't have to. Now, today, I want to talk about the new ban on conversion practices in Canada. It's a criminal ban. And you've probably heard about it. It's called Bill C4 now, but it used to be called Bill C6, and before that, Bill C8, if I recall my order correctly. It's a new law that criminalizes various behaviors surrounding conversion practices, but primarily bans offering conversion practices themselves. Conversion practices can be understood as a range of systematic practices that aim at changing, repressing, or discouraging someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or behaviors that are related to them. So for instance, forms of conversion practices may say, well, it's okay if you're gay, but you're not allowed to act on those feelings. And similarly, for being trans, it's okay to be trans, but you're not allowed to medically transition, for instance. Initially, the federal government in Canada did not want to pass a law. They had been asked about it, and the Minister of Justice had essentially come back and said, we're actually not going to adopt a law on it. We think that it's better addressed at the provincial level. The reason for that is that there is the jurisdictional issue. For many of the previous laws that have been passed against conversion practices, such as in Ontario, Nova Scotia, the law was framed as a disciplinary mechanism that could be enforced through licensing bodies. Some provinces, like now Quebec, have adopted laws that allow for civil lawsuits, so you can sue somebody who engages in conversion practices. And then in the US, there's been some other versions like unfair trade practices, so you sue them as a sort of consumer protection type of act. And then in Australia, some have adopted a human rights approach where you make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. What's notable is all of those things are actually within the power of the provinces, because jurisdictionally, most of the healthcare related powers actually belong to the provinces. So in Canada, jurisdiction between the federal and the provincial government is actually described in the Constitution. Section 91 and 92 have a list of things that is granted to the federal government and to the provincial government. One thing that does not feature on this list is healthcare by itself. So instead, healthcare is dealt with through other headings that are within the list. So for instance, in Canada, at the federal level, most of the laws are criminal laws. One of the main things, for instance, laws regarding drugs, regarding pharmaceuticals and food safety are considered historically criminal law because they were considered criminal law since even English law. Whether we find that's a compelling thing, it was kind of always considered that way. So a matter of law, it's relatively settled. The other things that are healthcare are primarily within the provincial level. So the regulation of professions is very much a quintessentially provincial jurisdiction. Similarly, under the heading of property and civil rights, everything that has to do with lawsuits, everything that has to do with human rights complaints and things like that, all fall under the provincial basket, unless it's, things like large banks or airlines, in which case it's federal because those are federally regulated. So human rights violations for federally regulated matters are under federal jurisdiction. But healthcare is not under these federally regulated things. So it kind of all falls under the provincial things. So for the feds, the idea was, well, we don't want really a criminal response. So we think it's really more for provinces to act. Shortly after, however, a Senate committee did a really large report on LGBTQIA2S+ health. And one of its recommendations was a really collective call for action against conversion practices. And when that report came out with such a clear mandate to do something against conversion practices, the federal government turned around and said, okay, we'll ban it. So we didn't hear from them for weeks and months after they said they would do it. And then eventually someday they just came out with a bill. Some people got a call telling them, hey, we're going to table the law in Parliament. Do you want to come to Ottawa in 2-3 days and be there for when it comes out? And a lot of people were frustrated at that time because they were like, why is this the first time we hear of this? Why didn't you consult us the entire time? Because I've been working, now I wasn't the one feeling that way, but I've been working with No Conversion Canada, which is kind of the premier crossroads where everybody who does advocacy against conversion practices meet. And through these channels, we figured out that almost no survivors and virtually no experts were consulted in drafting the bill. Instead, they kind of went on their own side, wrote the law, and then kind of presented to us as a fait accompli, and then we could criticize it in committee. But once it's presented, there's not that much change you can make. You can make small changes here and there, but kind of the bulk of the structure is already there and you're very limited. So a lot of people were kind of unhappy with that. A lot of people were also very unhappy with having a criminal law because they were fundamentally opposed to the idea of criminalization because they're prison abolitionists, but also because there's a lot of downsides to criminal law, which I'll focus on in my presentation. So there was a contemplated, discussions about how people felt about the law, but at the end of the day, the Liberals were committed to this and we're not gonna, go back to the drawing board. And so people kind of had to get behind the law in order to make it the best law possible that it could possibly become. And there were some improvements in it, notably removing the age requirement, because initially they wanted to ban it only for minors, and they've removed that age threshold. But there's still a lot of dissatisfaction with how it's been written and the way that the process was a little bit sloppy in many ways. now that we've, now that the law is passed and feelings have calmed down a bit and we can have more of a retrospective on what is happening, I think it's a good time to kind of go back on the law and think, well, why is a criminal law bad? Why is it bad to have a law like this that is actually, at the federal level and part of the criminal code, as opposed to, say, a provincial law or even a more kind of food and drug safety type regulatory law? So there are 4 reasons. The first one is that the criminal law is a blunt instrument. The second one is that it's really difficult to prove that someone, violated criminal law. The third reason is that policing and the criminal justice system are inherently violent systems. And the fourth one is that it is quite disempowering to survivors. So let me go through them one by one. So the first one is that the criminal law is a blunt instrument, right? As part of the jurisdictional issue that I spoke of a little bit earlier, the regulatory stuff is by and large left to the provinces. And if something looks too regulatory, that actually makes courts think that it might not be a criminal law and might instead be a provincial law. And repeatedly, every single law on health issues in recent years that have been adopted by the federal government under the heading of criminal law has been challenged in the courts and gone all the way up to the Supreme Court. A recent case involved the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, and before that in 2010, 2011, the Reproductive Health Assisted Human Reproduction Act. Both of them went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in both cases, there was a huge split in the Supreme Court as to whether the law was constitutional as a form of criminal law. And although kind of in extremis, both laws were considered constitutional, it was really on the line in both cases, and the splits were quite tight. So understandably, federal governments don't want to pass something that's too regulatory in how it looks, because if they do that, then they're up for a huge challenge, they're up for a huge controversy with the provinces. It starts a big fight between the provinces and the federal government. And generally speaking, they don't really want that. They'll do it if they have to, but usually they try to avoid that as much as possible. It's just a lot, it's very expensive for what they consider to be not good enough reasons. But then we're stuck with the criminal law system, and the criminal law system is fundamentally repressive, not regulatory or pedagogical. And what that means is that a typical criminal law looks like a short paragraph, 1 or 2 sentences that says, doing this is criminal. And the this is usually described in relatively small terms. And here we see it in this case. They have a very small, list of descriptions of what counts as conversion practices, but it's a very short list. It's basically, you can't, change, repress, discourage people, sexual orientation, blah, blah, blah. It's not very detailed. And why is that a problem? Well, the problem is that the people who are doing conversion practices are very sophisticated agents, by and large. There are people who are often licensed professionals. Around 50% of conversion practices in Canada are by licensed professionals, according to the data we have. A lot of them have, of the rest especially, are in some sort of spiritual counseling or religious position, often people who are very well read, well learned, and are relatively sophisticated in terms of making arguments and things like that. And they're very good at reframing their practices to say that's not conversion practices. The kind of classic historically has been people saying, well, I'm not actually trying to change somebody's sexual orientation. What I'm trying to do actually is treating their underlying trauma, and it just so happens that it makes them straight at the end. Now, of course, if you hang around them for more than 2 minutes, very quickly you see right through that, because they'll also tell you, well, all of my patients come because they have unwanted sexual attraction, what they call homosexual leanings. And, they'll also say things like, well, I believe that all or nearly all of these gender identities or sexual orientations are actually maladaptive, are kind of like maladaptive coping skills for trauma. I don't really think that it's normal to be trans or gay or bisexual. And they'll say, well, generally, I don't think that people should be acting out on that. So their justification is really kind of a rhetorical sleight of hand, but it's one that becomes important to clarify in the law, because otherwise nobody's going to actually go after them. Recently, there was a specific version of that argument that's coalesced around the terminology of gender exploratory therapy that I've recently published about in Perspectives in Psychological Science. Also, if I refer to papers, you can find all of them at www.florenceashley.com. And if you go in the academic publications tab, you can find all of my papers there. So recently I wrote about this new idea of gender exploratory therapy, and well, that sounds great, doesn't it? Like gender exploration, who would be against that? Nobody. But once you actually dig down in it, it becomes rapidly clear that they generally think that being trans is a mental illness, is a maladaptive thing that comes from sexual trauma, or that comes from internalized homophobia or internalized misogyny, and casts all trans identities in doubt. And then the so-called exploration is really about finding reasons to reject it. It's let's go dig deep down to explain why you're having this pathology that makes you think you're trans. So really quickly, it shows itself not to be quite that positive thing that the name might suggest. And a lot of these rhetorical tricks are things that legislation should hopefully address, at least in general lines, to prevent this sort of rhetorical sleight of hands. Because, the reality is, as of today, most of the biggest names in the history of conversion practices that are still alive today are still practicing freely in jurisdictions that have had bans on conversion practices for anywhere up to a decade. So the reality is that these kind of general terms, relatively blunt descriptions in the laws have shown themselves to be largely insufficient. That's the first big issue of the blunt instrument of the law, of the criminal law. And it is one that is inherently tied to the fact that as a jurisdiction, the federal government, because they have to do only criminal law, are much limited in their ability to pass laws that are more regulatory, more pedagogical, more human rights in their nature. And that's much more of a provincial thing. And provinces need to pass laws that actually do all those things. Now, the fact that they still use the same kind of blunt and nondescript definitions is another problem. But if they wanted to do better, they could. They have that jurisdictional power. So that's the first point, blunt instrument. The second one is it's really hard to prove that somebody engaged in conversion practices. Proving a crime is usually hard-ish. Depending if cops decide to lie, that can make it easier. That's a bad thing. Not a big fan of cops. We'll get to that later, though. But in conversion practices, almost everything is about the intent. There is almost no debate as to whether somebody engaged in certain acts that are therapy-like or that are some sort of like structured and systemic practice. Where the debate is whether the person did it with the intent of changing, repressing, or discouraging the person's sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity. That's where the debate is. But intent, even if we can infer it from things people write, from things people say, etc., is still first and foremost the state of mind. And if the practitioner decides not to talk, then there's very little that you can do to get that information out of their heads. If they don't tell the patients what their motives are, then it's going to be very difficult to prove it. And so there's a huge difficulty. And to add to that difficulty, in criminal law, you can't force them to testify. You have a right not to testify against yourself. That is an important, really crucial constitutional right. That's a right that does not exist in civil law. So if you're doing a human rights complaint, if you're doing a professional licensing complaint, if you're doing a lawsuit for medical malpractice, they don't get to invoke their, I guess, right to silence, you might call it, in court. They can be forced to testify, and if they refuse, you can draw negative inferences from them. So you can draw the inference that they did what they refused to defend themselves against. That's something you can do in non-criminal law that you can't do in criminal law, because there is a presumption of innocence in criminal law. And you have these constitutional rights not to testify against yourself, and a violation of those rights would occur if you draw negative inferences from it. The right to silence is also the right not to be penalized for staying silent. Part of the issue is also the burden of proof. If I sue somebody for doing conversion practices on me as a medical malpractice suit, I just have to prove that it's more likely than not that they did it. I have to say 50% plus 1. That's how likely it is that they did it, and then I win my case. In a criminal trial, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's much higher than 50%. There's no good number for it, but let's say it's like 90-95% chance that they're guilty. That's really high. It's very difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the intent that they had in engaging in what they consider to be therapeutic practices. It's going to be very hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they intended to change somebody's sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. So what might happen in most cases is that if they do lay charges against a conversion practitioner, then there's a very high chance that they won't get convicted because they won't be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's especially true considering that courts and juries tend to trust licensed professionals. They're very compelling. They are very eloquent. They have a lot of degrees. They might, have sat on really fancy boards and committees and professional associations. They're the kind of people that the court system is built to trust. And they might still think that they're guilty, but not reach beyond a reasonable doubt. They're going to be much more hesitant to convict. The third point is that policing and the criminal justice system are inherently violent. And for a lot of, queer and trans people, that's not something we want to support. Historically, the police and the criminal justice system have been enemies of trans people. We remember the sex garage raids in Montreal. We remember the gay bathhouse raids in Toronto. We remember Stonewall, Compton Cafeteria. Just more recently, we remember places like Florida, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, trying to or successfully criminalizing gender-affirming care or being an out and about trans person or speaking about sexual orientation, gender identity in schools. These systems have been deeply violent for trans and queer people, especially for queer and trans people who are Black, who are Indigenous, or who are otherwise from disabled, racialized communities. The system is, in Canada, Indigenous people make up like 30% of the carceral population, despite only a fraction of that as a percentage of the population. When you're passing a criminal law, you're in a way putting your weight behind the legitimacy of those systems, saying, well, we think that the system is actually generally just and it's okay to engage with it. And what it does is it puts a lot of power in the hands, not of survivors, but of police and of prosecutors. It's police and prosecutors who are going to decide who they go after with the criminal justice system. And it might very well backfire or be used in ways that we don't want, because it's so difficult to go after somebody who knows how to protect themselves against the law, somebody who is well-learned, well-read, and a generally sophisticated social and legal actor. The people who are going to be most easy to criminalize and to charge with engaging in conversion practices are those who are not the kind of big conversion practitioners. It's going to be instead families or survivors who were caught up in the system and ended up participating in conversion practices along with other people, because that's something that happens quite a lot. Survivors will, go to these kind of clinics to, pray away the gay, and once they're, told that they're cured, they get recruited into collaborating into that system, and then numerous of but are so traumatized and so kind of like, you might say, brainwashed even, that they're going to be much more easily caught by the system and criminalized and unable to really effectively defend themselves. Whereas the ones who are at the top actually doing all those actions, the Exodus Internationals of the world, they're the ones who are going to get away with it. They're the ones who are sophisticated enough to beat those charges or not be charged in the first place. So there is a fear that if we give that discretionary power to the police, they're going to use it against the wrong people. And then there's also the bigger fear that the criminal justice system is unjust. A lot of us want an end to policing and to prisons. We don't want them to exist. So what does it say that now we're supporting it in this context? Shouldn't we be the ones at the front of the line showing how to do without prisons, to do without police? How can we deal with these social problems without recourse to the carceral state? That ties into my next point, which is the criminal justice system is incredibly disempowering to survivors because, like I said, the discretion, the power doesn't go in the hand of survivors. It goes in the hands of cops and it goes in the hands of prosecutors. When you experience conversion practices, you then have to call the police and go make a complaint. Police might, dismiss you, laugh at you, engage in further violence against you, re-traumatize you, essentially. And then prosecutors might, decide, I don't care, we're not going to lay charges. On the flip side, perhaps if they do lay charges, and if later you find that you're in the criminal justice system process, you're going through the trial process, and it's just too much for you and you want to break and you want to kind of step away, they can use their powers to force you to testify. They can force your involvement because once the machine is started, they're in charge, not you. And even if you don't want them to pursue the charges anymore, they can do it. They can ignore what you want, and keep on going. And they do that quite often already. Do they prefer if people collaborate? Yeah, but they'll still do it without your collaboration if they think that's what's right in their mind. Which also gives you very little control over the process, very little control over the speed at which things go, little control over, how you manage the information that you give and receive, who is going to be a witness. Do you want to force this or that other survivor to testify, or do you prefer to, knowing what it's like as a survivor, do you want to also prevent them that trauma? All of these decisions are taken from your hands. you don't really have power over them, unlike in a civil lawsuit where you're the one suing. You don't have absolute control of everything because there's still a sort of standardized process, but you have a lot of say in how things unfold because you're the party, you're the plaintiff, you're the one that's suing. The process is kind of all about you. So, having something alternative to criminal law can be really a way of being more empowering to survivors. So if we kind of synthesize, well, the law is bad because it's too blunt to actually capture clearly the kind of acts that we want to capture. It's super difficult to prove an offense, so it essentially is almost impossible for anybody to actually go to jail over it. Even if they did go to jail, there's no reason to think that the police will use their discretion in a way that doesn't target those who are the most marginalized and vulnerable. And it does prop up the carceral state. And the process itself, regardless of the outcome, is really disempowering for survivors and can end up re-traumatizing them and make it even worse than if they hadn't engaged in the process. All for what might turn out to be absolutely no vindication whatsoever because of the very high burden of proof. So what's the alternative? Well, there's a lot of things that can be done, and the first step of the government should have been not to start penning its own law, but to actually sit down with survivors and with community and scholarly experts to really sit down and pen, figure out a list of what are the things that survivors want and how can that be implemented at the federal and at the provincial level. So the first thing that people need is still in the kind of logic of pointing at something, saying bad and don't do that. Could have multi-pronged provincial laws that really kind of attack conversion practices multiple level. So you can have it be simultaneously considered a disciplinary violation so that it can impact your licensing, a tort so that you can sue for medical malpractice or some other sort of malpractice, so like negligence action, and also have it considered a human rights violation so that if you don't have the money to go through the civil lawsuit system and find a personal injury lawyer and things like that, you can rely on the kind of inquisitive powers of the Human Rights Commission that can actually go and do an investigation, and then if they find that your complaint is substantiated, represent you before the Human Rights Tribunal. So that's 3 prongs, and then you can also consider other things like what about what if we look at consumer protection law, which some places in the US have done. Now, I would say in the US, part of why that one has been looked at a lot is because of difficulties around constitutional powers and around free speech protection. So it's in part a US specific kind of response that we don't necessarily have to take in Canada. But the idea is we can think big in terms of what channels we want to engage in addressing conversion practices. The second big alternative thing that needs to be done is funding. Right now, there is virtually no appropriate funding for the mental health survivors. Survivors of conversion practices don't have access to the mental health services that they need to heal from that trauma. Not only that, but there's been virtually no research in it because funding bodies have largely just not really put in the money into doing research as to what clinical and therapeutic approaches would help them heal best. Funding is also a question of the advocacy and the organizations. We need funding for survivor-led advocacy organizations and peer support groups because most of the time, the only people that survivors feel can understand them is other survivors. And you need to have enough of that funding at the organizational level that it can have these peer support groups and get together and kind of, heal together. You also need the thing for the advocacy thing because advocacy is ongoing. You don't just pass along, forget it. You need ongoing education, things like that. And that requires money. That requires money so that people can get salaries and pay staff so that they can do that educational labor. Another thing, in terms of money to sue, legal aid funding, and also money to defend yourself, because you know who is really, 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 really good at suing people? Conversion practitioners who don't like when you call them out on being conversion practitioners. When in the lead up to the federal bill, so many people around me started getting cease and desists and threats of defamation suits, or just straight up defamation suits over over calling somebody a conversion practitioner. A peer review paper I wrote, our lead co-authors both were sued in California over suggesting that a specific term was a synonym for conversion practices. Like, it's a stretch. Very litigious people, and you know, a lot of very litigious people that are engaging in conversion practices or who are suspected of engaging in conversion practices. And yeah, you need money to defend against those claims. Another thing to change is professional culture. You know, professions can mandate each other to start looking at how we implant anti-conversion practices, training and accountability within professions. I dedicate an entire chapter of my book on changing professional culture. And then all of the other ways, so many other alternatives. One that I really like, very creative one, go after corporate and charity law. Corporations can get dissolved if they engage in conversion practices. They've done that in the US with a huge conversion practitioner named Jonah. It was an organization, religious organization, and courts dissolved them after finding that they were in the business of doing conversion practices. Could we change the law to do that in Canada too? That sounds like a good idea. Similarly, if you have organizations that without engaging in conversion practices are known to, you know, refer and facilitate conversion practices, which can happen in like churches, for instance, threaten their charitable status, which gives them preferential tax treatment. They're still allowed to exist because they're not engaging in conversion practices nor directly advertising it. But that doesn't mean we have to give them tax cuts, you know. And if you target those purse strings, chances are it's going to make it much, much, much harder to engage in conversion practices. And, you know, a few actors are responsible for a really large number of conversion practices. There's a lot of small actors too, but it's still in many ways a business for a lot of those people. And as a business, they try to grow as big as they can. And when you hit them where it hurts in the money, that actually makes it harder for them to keep on growing and to keep on offering conversion practices to a lot of people. So the fight against conversion practices is a really big and complex one. There's no one size solution that will just eradicate conversion practices. You need a multi-pronged approach that hits at very different levels, and that these alternatives really need to be figured out by working closely and under the leadership of survivors. But what I think that solution doesn't include, or perhaps shouldn't include, is a criminal law, which has so many limitations that it can quite arguably be said to be to do more harm than good. And there's something a bit sad that when the law passed, a few people and I were talking, and we said our best case scenario is possibly the law not being applied because we're afraid of how it would be applied. And if it's not applied, then at least it has symbolic force without being misused. And when people who have dedicated their lives to fighting conversion practices are taking that position, are doubting whether the law should even be used, that speaks to a really fundamental problem in how we're thinking about law and how we're thinking about fighting conversion practices. So I'll end now. I'm really eager to hear your questions on this. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And if you're interested, very pretty book.
Thanks so much, Florence. And we've got time for, we've got about 20 minutes for questions. So I'm really hoping that that we'll get some really good ones. You know, before, as the questions start to come in, I guess there are a couple that I maybe I could kick off with. And one of the things I really appreciated about what you presented today, especially for like myself, I don't have a law background, although I work in policy and have some familiarity. I think sometimes many of us will misunderstand the role of different types of law and at what level it operates. Because, and you even talked, even one of your comments right now is about symbolic weight of the current law right now. And so somebody looking from the outside on this, without an insight on this, might say, wow, the ban on conversion practices really tells a story about how seriously we are taking this in Canada, that at the federal level, this has been criminalized. Mm-hmm. And not only that, that means that every province and territory is responsible to ensure that, I mean, that the law is applied. So on the one hand, we have this almost like symbolic weight that comes from that type of, you know, that type of legal move around this. On the other hand, it sounds like as well, the alternative might be, well, if it was more of a provincial matter, a regulatory matter at that level, that would have been helpful too. But I wonder, might we then see amplification, variation across the province? And is that also a risk? I'm just like, it sounds like there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and it's how do we find our way through this, especially now that we do actually have a criminal code amendment. So yeah, maybe say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'll put on a new beer to answer. And so yeah, it's a complex thing, you know, even if we ignore kind of like the specific issues with the criminal law and we think more kind of like big picture of like wanting everything covered, you know, there's really a kind of like double like flip side to how the criminal law works, because on the one hand you're like, yeah, every territory and province is responsible, it's sending kind of a clear mandate, yet at the same time a lot of provinces and territories are responding essentially, well, it's been done at the federal level, so why do we have to do anything? We're done. You don't need a provincial law, you don't need municipal laws, because you've already got a federal law. And then when we come back and answer, yeah, but a federal law is not effective, it's a criminal law, it's very limited, it's not being applied, their answer is, well, it's already done. And it's also not politically sexy to campaign on a law that's most people in the general population think already covers everything, right? So it's really hard to sell it to the provinces, but then it's also really hard for members of parliament and members of national legislative assemblies to sell it to other people in their caucus, being like, yeah, we're going to spend a lot of resources on developing this law, because they're like, well, why should we do that? We're not going to get the political benefit from it because everybody thinks it's already banned. So there's a huge kind of like communication issue that comes with it. And one of the things we were pushing the federal government for is to make a really clear statement that like this is really just the first step. It's really just the beginning. We still need the provinces to act. I don't think that they've made that statement in any way clear, and I am, you know, not very happy with how the federal government has acted. I realize that there's a lot of complex things that happen with the Conservatives ending up giving consent to the bill, which sped up the process, which kind of cut away ways to fix things. You know, could have gone to committee again, but then it couldn't go to committee again, so you couldn't get the revisions in. So it's complicated. But there is a problem in perception, I think, that is really at the heart of this, in terms of like the misunderstanding of what the law does and how it relates to provincial action.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that are coming up from viewers today. One of them is just really, maybe it's picking up on my opening question was, so given that the law is passed, it's received royal assent, you've mapped out what like a multi-pronged strategy might be. What would your advice then be to a province that might be interested to move forward on this? Where should they be focusing? Where should a province focus its energy? Because on the one hand, there's to minimize the harms of this approach. You've really flagged that in terms of, by virtue of framing it as a crime, it puts it into the carceral system. There's that part of it. But then a lot of your research and a lot of your writing is also talking about really this emerges within a clinical context too, right? So maybe it fits better. Maybe there's opportunities within that intersection in the caring environment to the, so.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you know, the first step, I think there's two first steps. The first step is the easy first step is they should pick up my book and go to chapter 7, where I have an annotated model law that says, here's a text you can take and adopt into a law. And then here's, I haven't counted, but a lot of pages explaining every single little detail in why this is there, why you need this, how you can frame it differently based on jurisdiction, because some language, you know, it's legalese, so each jurisdiction does things differently. But the gist is, you know, it's all in there, and I describe a lot of things in great detail, and also give a mapping to how to approach this, how it's not just, yes, there is the kind of like copy paste element, but it's also about, you know, this is a starting point. What you need to do is sit down with survivors, sit down with advocates that have been doing this work for like 5-10 years, and who will say, okay, these are the things that we need, and start with their word in drafting the law rather than drafting a law, bringing it to them, and then working from there. So I think the first step is to engage in like genuine consultation process, talk to the expert, talk to survivors, community experts, scholars, and make sure you get it right at the first tabling, because your opportunity to like change it afterwards are going to be quite limited. And I don't think it's necessary to, you know, do one thing at a time. Like you can do a lot of the things that I've talked about, you know, a lot of the things like charity laws, provincial laws, multi-pronged funding, professional culture. A lot of those things can actually be done in one law. It's not necessary to start splitting it up. And in fact, splitting it up, in my experience, is a way to kick the bucket down the road, because the federal government said they would dedicate money to it. They promised so many times. And I mean, we're still waiting, you know, there's still haven't heard anything about that money that was supposed to go to survivors' mental health and organizations. So I am concerned about legislatures that try to split it up in multiple things. And I think it's actually quite feasible to do everything kind of all at once as much as you can. Obviously, there's complexities at some junctures, but by and large, you can do all of it.
Yeah, so another question, and I think it picks up on regardless of which level and which type of law might be engaged and what type of regulatory body might be tasked with or invite the opportunity to work on this. I wonder how we might turn our minds to the conceptual challenge, the definitional challenge that you flagged. So what counts as a conversion practice? Because, you know, with past experience working with regulatory bodies, clinical regulatory bodies, definition matters a lot, like what is in and what is out and what it is, because, I mean, with regulated professionals, particularly regulated health professionals, knowing what is within scope of practice and what is not is really important. So are there ways to sort of grapple with that definitional problem that would be beneficial regardless of which type of law we may be talking about? Because it doesn't seem like a legal matter so much as something else.
Yeah, so obviously the conceptual question is a very complex one. It has a lot of moving pieces, and definitions are never, you don't have general definitions. You have definitions for specific purposes, right? If you're writing a definition for a mandate, you're not going to write the same definition as for a law. And depending what kind of law you're writing, you're not going to have the same definition, because different definitions serve different purposes. And it's important that the definition be tailored to what you're trying to do and what you're trying to capture. However, when we're trying to conceptualize what counts as conversion practices, I think it's better to think about the underlying ideology before you get to what it tries to do. By that, I mean that first and foremost, what links together conversion practices, regardless of how you want to describe the intent and everything, is they are linked together by this view that there is one right way to live your gender and sexuality, and that all other ways of living it are inferior, undesirable, sinful, immoral, choose your negative word. It's this idea that there's something wrong with being trans, being gay, being queer, being lesbian, being bisexual. That's the heart of conversion practices. And then, what makes it conversion practices instead of something else is then, how you act on that belief. And then, we can get about the talk of, like I mentioned, it has to be something of a systematic approach. It's not just kind of the occasional word, it's not the same as persuasion. It has to be geared towards, so we can, talk about all those things and explain what differentiates conversion practices from just general, say, religious homophobia. But the seed that you're starting from, this very core that you should always start a discussion and you're thinking from, is this idea that there's something wrong with being queer, with being trans. And from there, go where you want to go. So I think when we're thinking about a conceptual challenge, the first thing to ask ourselves is, does this or that practice reflect that sort of negativity? That's your starting question, and then you can have more questions along the route. But that's the first question you should be asking yourself. And I do think that it actually gets you pretty far. It doesn't do everything, because the line between systematic and non-systematic gets fuzzy, and there's all of those kind of questions, and there's a lot of edge cases. That's the nature of law. But if you start with that question, you're kind of going to be on the right track.
Yeah, so Florence, one of the things that I noticed in some of your other publications that really stands out for me, and it kind of made me pause as a cisgender woman. There was a comment there about how society genders us, like we are gendered regardless, and also that there is the ideology that favors heterosexual and cisgender identities is so invisible to so many of us, that we may actually be, like I may be a proponent of banning of conversion practices, but not even seeing myself and recognizing myself the heterosexual normativity that I own and I carry with me, or my cisgenderedness. So there's something really deep underneath this that a criminal code amendment can't change, or a new regulatory practice can't change, that and so I wonder if it's getting at what one of your planks in an approach, which is around, you mentioned professional culture and perhaps training and accountability. What else? It is because we are enculturated. Society shapes us. We don't always choose.
Yeah.
But we are what we are given, and in some way. So where else might we go with that? And of course, I'm sitting at academic institution asking the question.
Absolutely, and it's hard to recognize at times. I think once we ask the question, it's already a good step towards answering it. Like sometimes, a lot of time, I think when we don't recognize it, it's because we're not thinking about it, right? We're kind of like, passing by without kind of sitting down and thinking it through. But kind of setting that aside, I mean, there is the problem of, what's the quote that I'm going to butcher? Something about if you want to make pancakes, you got to invent the universe. I wouldn't say that was like Douglas Adams, like Space Odyssey or something. But if you want to eradicate conversion practices, you've got to change culture. You've got to change the world. And here, new goatee. I don't like this one. This one's nice. Okay. Okay, I'm done with the goatees. You've got to change culture. So professional culture is one, and I think there's a lot to be said about changing, professional acculturation through integrating it properly within professional training, like from the university level, like straight up. But then, there's a lot more people who need to be taught how to recognize conversion practices, people who work in child welfare. And I have a lot of other asterisks for child welfare because, like the criminal justice system, it is also an extremely violent system. But having people have training on how to spot conversion practices, not how to react, because one of the kind of child protection tendency might be, oh, we're going to take the kid away from their parent. And you're like, well, is that necessarily the best step? Like, because you don't know yet if the parent can be, reasoned with and educated. Because, yeah, some parents are like deeply transphobic and homophobic, but my experience and the data backs it up. A lot of parents don't know what they're sending their kids to. A lot, there were, in a recent study with Travis Salway, I think we said around 40% of parents were not aware that they were sending their kid to conversion practices. And a lot of time, even if they're aware, you've got somebody with a doctor of psychology telling them, this is what you do if you love your kid, this is the right thing to do. And they're like, okay, well, I mean, I guess so. And so there's a lot of, and that's where the training needs to come in, where you need to like have an idea of how to deal with families who, send their kids to conversion practices, and to differentiate between the parent who's in that situation kind of being misled or there's an abuse of authority, and the parents who are like really kind of violently transphobic and really do want to kind of like essentially the worst for their kid. I mean, they don't conceive it as the worst for the kid, but in the sense that like they don't have this kind of like benevolent, like I'm just trying to do the best for my kid kind of thing. They're really like, no, we'll never accept a kid of mine being queer. So need to be able to differentiate that. But then there's also stuff like, what if teachers know more about conversion practices so that he can spot it and kind of softly intervene? Or what if teenagers and stuff like that have a little bit of education about it, not necessarily a whole lot, but just enough to be able to spot things that kind of look a little bit conversion therapy, and then go talk to somebody who might be able to help. So there is a need for very broad education, and I think the first people that need that education are the people who are in contact with these kids all the time. So like parents, social workers, teachers, things like that. And then the other one, the people themselves, because so many people ostensibly consent to conversion practices because they have so much internalized homophobia and transphobia and are afraid of being disowned, are afraid of the social ramifications, are afraid of being excommunicated, rejected from their community. And there are people who need that interventions, ahead of submitting to conversion practices. So you do need to kind of change culture at like a broad level, and that's a big task. It's not something you can do with legislation right away. Some of the people can be changed with legislation. You can add it to the mandate of regulatory bodies and things like that. But at the broader scale, what is needed is a change in society. We need to change society to make conversion practices, you know, not so much impossible as unthinkable, because it's only when conversion practices are unthinkable that they will actually become impossible, not by legal fiat.
Oh gosh, Florence, thank you so much for a tremendous presentation and conversation that we've had. There were some sort of comments of encouragement from the in the chat saying, "Wow, no question, but thank you." I mean, so that like that, and also a question that just as something to add to the mix of sort of maybe pools of prongs here, is about understanding the interaction of the criminal code amendment and what it does to fostering more research in the area and supporting that, because the strength of your scholarship is that you are looking at what is the evidence that we have now, how does that inform, how do we engage survivors and also trans people in shaping policy, which really does require the academic community showing up to this and really fostering that. So that's research funders, researchers. And so anyway, I just want to thank you so much for a tremendous talk. And I think many people have learned a lot. And I have just a couple of announcements before we completely wrap up. So information about upcoming JCB seminars will be announced shortly in our bi-weekly JCB Events Digest. So if you aren't already receiving the weekly email reminders or aren't part of the distribution list for the JCB Events Digest, I invite any of you to just send an email to jcb.info, info, at utoronto.ca, and that will be put into the YouTube chat for you. And indeed, we welcome you back for our next seminar, which you'll hear about shortly. But in the meantime, Florence, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for your scholarship in this area and your leadership. Thank you for the presentation and the insights that you shared with us today.